Imagine walking into a courtroom, feeling like your entire world is on the line, and being ready to reveal a secret that could change everything. This is the story of a single mother who did just that, and the outcome was nothing short of stunning. The morning sun streamed through the tall windows of the Santa Monica courthouse, casting long shadows across the polished wooden floors. The courtroom was already filled to capacity, with spectators whispering among themselves, creating an atmosphere thick with anticipation and tension. The old wooden benches creaked occasionally as people shifted in their seats, waiting for the proceedings to begin. Sarah Thompson paused at the heavy oak doors, her heart pounding against her ribs. Her worn shoes, carefully polished for today, made a distinct clicking sound as she took her first steps into the courtroom. Each click seemed to echo in the vast space, drawing all eyes to her small frame. She smoothed down her simple dress, fighting the urge to turn and run. From the plaintiff's table, Miranda Wilson looked up from her documents, her eyes sharp and calculating. At 50, she had built her reputation as one of the city's most formidable lawyers by never backing down from a fight. Her black suit was immaculate, her silver hair perfectly styled, every detail of her appearance designed to intimidate. She watched Sarah's approach with the focused attention of a chess player studying their opponent's opening move. The public gallery was packed with familiar faces. Sarah recognized her neighbors, local shopkeepers, and even some parents from her children's school. Some offered sympathetic smiles, while others whispered behind raised hands. In the back row, Linda Carter, Sarah's closest friend, sat with her hands clasped tightly in her lap, offering a small nod of encouragement. As Sarah took her seat, she could feel Miranda's gaze still fixed on her. The lawyer's expression was unreadable, but her body language spoke volumes. She was ready for battle, confident in her position, determined to win. This wasn't just another case for her. It was a chance to prove once again why she was considered one of the best in her field. The bailiff stepped forward, preparing to announce the judge's entrance. Sarah's fingers found the small photo of Jake and Ethan in her pocket, drawing strength from their smiling faces. The morning light caught the edge of Miranda's reading glasses as she made one final review of her notes, her jaw set with determination. The stage was set for a battle that would change lives forever. As Sarah stood in the oppressive silence of the courtroom, her searching eyes found their anchor. Linda Carter, seated in the back row. Her closest friend's warm, encouraging smile cut through the heaviness like a ray of sunlight through storm clouds. Linda gave a slight nod, a gesture so subtle others might have missed it, but to Sarah it carried the weight of countless late nights spent over tear-stained conversations and cups of coffee, Linda's steady voice always reminding her, "You're stronger than you think." Her hand instinctively slipped into her pocket, fingers finding the familiar contours of her mother's necklace. The delicate silver chain, with its heart pendant, was worn smooth from years of nervous touches, the last gift her mother had given her before passing away. Holding it made Sarah feel her mother's presence, bringing back her words. "Truth is the strongest shield we have, Sarah. No matter how scary it seems, it will protect you in the end." Between Linda's steadfast presence and the comforting weight of her mother's necklace, Sarah felt something shift inside her. The paralyzing fear that had gripped her began to loosen its hold. Yes, Duke Morrison sat at the defendant's table, his threatening presence impossible to ignore. Yes, her future hung precariously in the balance, but she wasn't alone in this fight. She had Linda's unwavering friendship, her mother's guiding memory, and most importantly, her own truth. Drawing in a deep breath, Sarah lifted her chin slightly. The necklace wasn't just a piece of jewelry, it was a testament to her heritage, her values. And Linda's presence wasn't just friendly support, it was proof that even in the darkest times, some people would always see beyond her mistakes to the person she truly was. Sarah remembers that fateful morning as clearly as if it were yesterday. The early October sun was just beginning to filter through the kitchen blinds, casting long shadows across the worn linoleum floor. She had padded downstairs in her faded blue robe, expecting to find Mark at the kitchen table with his usual cup of coffee and morning paper. Instead, she found only silence and a single sheet of paper, its white surface stark against the dark wood of the table. Her heart skipped a beat when she recognized Mark's distinctive handwriting, the slightly slanted letters she had grown so familiar with over their 12 years of marriage. At first, her mind refused to process the words before her. I can't take this pressure anymore. Forgive me. The simplicity of the message felt like a slap across her face. 7 words to end 12 years of marriage, to abandon their family, to shatter their children's world. Her hands trembling, Sarah reached for her phone, nearly knocking over a glass in her haste. She dialed Mark's number, listening to the rings echo in her ear. 1 ring, 2 rings, 3. With each unanswered ring, the knot in her stomach grew tighter. When his voicemail clicked on, his recorded voice sounding eerily normal, something inside her snapped. She tried again, and again, and again. Each attempt more desperate than the last, each unanswered call driving home the devastating reality. He was gone. Anger and fear warred within her chest as she stood in the kitchen, the morning light now seeming harsh and unforgiving. How could he? How dare he? The questions pounded in her head like a relentless drumbeat, but beneath the anger lurked a more terrifying emotion: panic. How would she tell the boys? How would she explain that their father had chosen to walk away, leaving nothing but a hastily scribbled note? Upstairs, she could hear Jake and Ethan beginning to stir. The familiar sounds of their morning routine, Jake's bedroom door creaking open, Ethan's sleepy footsteps padding across the hallway, now felt like a countdown to an inevitable explosion. She quickly wiped her eyes, stuffed the note in her pocket, and tried to compose herself. But how does one compose oneself to break their children's hearts? The day passed in a blur of forced normalcy and dodged questions. Where's Dad? When's he coming home? Each innocent query felt like a knife twisting in her gut. It wasn't until that night, after a dinner nobody really ate, that reality truly sank in. Sarah sat on the living room couch, her boys cuddled close on either side. The television droned quietly in the background, but none of them were watching it. Mom? Jake's voice was small, so different from his usual confident tone. Is Dad coming back? The question hung in the air, heavy with all the pain and confusion a 10-year-old boy shouldn't have to feel. Sarah pulled him closer, feeling his small body trembling against hers. Ethan, too young to fully understand but old enough to sense the wrongness of the situation, pressed his face into her side. The truth caught in her throat. How could she explain abandonment to children who still believed in unconditional love? How could she tell them that sometimes people we trust the most can hurt us the deepest? Instead, she held them tighter, her tears falling silently into Jake's dark hair as Ethan's quiet sniffles filled the room. The 3 of them sat there, huddled together in their broken world, while outside their window, the rest of the world continued on, oblivious to the family fracturing within these walls. The first call came on a Tuesday morning, just as Sarah was rushing to get the boys ready for school. The phone's shrill ring cut through the usual chaos of breakfast time, and an unfamiliar voice identified himself as being from First National Bank. Sarah's stomach dropped as she listened to words like overdue payments and immediate attention required. She managed to get through the call, her voice steady even as her hands shook while packing Jake's lunch. But that was just the beginning. The calls kept coming, each one revealing a new layer of financial horror Mark had left behind. Credit card companies, loan officers, debt collectors, their voices began to blur together in a nightmarish chorus of mounting obligations. With each call, Sarah learned of another account she hadn't known about, another loan taken out in their name, another mountain of debt that had been hidden from her. She started keeping a notebook, trying to make sense of the numbers. Each evening, after the boys were asleep, she would sit at the kitchen table, adding up figures that seemed impossible. The total grew larger and larger until the number stared back at her from the page like a malevolent entity: $247,000. The amount was so large it seemed almost abstract, like Monopoly money. Except this was terrifyingly real. The breaking point came on a sunny Thursday afternoon. Sarah had just returned from her second job, a part-time position she'd taken at a local diner to try to keep up with the bills. As she walked up the driveway, she spotted a man in a crisp suit standing at her door, an official-looking envelope in his hand. Her heart seemed to stop mid-beat when he introduced himself as a representative from the bank's foreclosure department. The boys were in the living room corner, building an elaborate fortress out of Legos. Jake was showing Ethan how to make the towers taller, their laughter a stark contrast to the grave conversation taking place in the kitchen. Sarah's fingers gripped the edge of the counter as she looked at the foreclosure notice, the legal jargon swimming before her eyes. All she could focus on was the deadline, 30 days to vacate. Through the kitchen doorway, she could see their little world in that corner, the weathered carpet where she'd taught Jake to crawl, the wall marked with pencil lines showing their growth, the window where they'd watch for the school bus every morning. Memories layered upon memories in every inch of this house, and now they were about to lose it all. The thought of her boys without a home, without the security of these familiar walls, sent a pain through her chest so sharp it stole her breath. Ethan's delighted squeal as their Lego tower reached new heights echoed through the house. Sarah watched them, these innocent children who had already lost their father and now stood to lose the only stability they had left. The foreclosure notice trembled in her hands as tears blurred her vision. This house wasn't just walls and a roof. It was Saturday morning pancakes in the kitchen, bedtime stories in their rooms, birthday parties in the backyard. It was their sanctuary, their safe place in a world that had already taken too much from them. The bank representative cleared his throat, his uncomfortable shuffle bringing Sarah back to the present moment. He was saying something about options, about programs for families in distress, but his words seemed to come from very far away. All Sarah could think about was how she would tell her boys they had to leave the only home they'd ever known. How could she explain that the locks would be changed, that strangers would live in their rooms, that all those pencil marks on the wall would probably be painted over? It was well past midnight when Sarah's shift at the diner ended. The neon signs cast eerie shadows across the empty parking lot as she walked to her car, her feet aching from hours of running between tables. That's when she heard a familiar voice call her name. Turning around, she found herself face to face with Duke Morrison, a ghost from her past she hadn't seen in years. Duke looked exactly as she remembered him from their high school days. Tall, well-dressed, with that same confident smile that had made him popular back then. But there was something different in his eyes now, a calculated gleam that should have been her first warning. "Sarah Thompson," he said, leaning against his expensive car. "Life's been rough on you, hasn't it?" Maybe it was exhaustion, or desperation, or simply the weight of carrying her burdens alone for so long. But Sarah found herself pouring out her story in that dimly lit parking lot. Duke listened intently, making sympathetic noises at all the right moments. When she finished, he placed a gentle hand on her shoulder, his voice soft and understanding. "I might be able to help you out of this mess." His proposal seemed simple enough at first. "Just deliver some packages, documents," he said, from one office to another. The pay was more than she made in a month at the diner. "Nothing illegal," he assured her with that winning smile. "Just helping some businessmen cut through red tape." Sarah hesitated, her instincts screaming that something wasn't right. But then she thought of the foreclosure notice at home, of Jake's worn-out shoes, of Ethan's upcoming school fees. The first few deliveries went smoothly. Duke would text her an address, she'd pick up a package, drop it off somewhere else, and find an envelope of cash in her mailbox the next day. She told herself she was just doing courier work, nothing more. The money helped her catch up on some bills, buy new clothes for the boys, even start a small emergency fund. Then came the day that changed everything. One of the packages tore slightly during delivery, and Sarah caught a glimpse of what was inside. Her blood ran cold as she recognized the distinct color and texture of counterfeit bills. Her hands trembled as she pulled over to the side of the road, the reality of what she'd been involved in crashing down around her. That evening, she confronted Duke outside his office, her voice shaking with anger and fear. "I'm done," she declared. "I won't deliver any more packages." But Duke's friendly demeanor vanished instantly, replaced by something cold and threatening. He stepped closer, his towering frame casting a shadow over her. "You don't get to be done, Sarah," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You're in this now, and if you try to walk away..." He pulled out his phone, showing her photos of Jake and Ethan at their school playground. "I'd hate to see those beautiful boys of yours suffer because their mother made a stupid decision." The threat hung in the air like poison bee, seeping into every corner of Sarah's world. She looked at the photos on his phone, Jake pushing Ethan on the swings, both of them laughing, completely unaware of being watched. Her chest tightened with a fear more profound than anything she'd felt before. This wasn't just about her anymore. She'd unknowingly placed her children in the crosshairs of a dangerous man. Duke's smile returned, but now she saw it for what it really was, the grin of a predator who had caught his prey. "Smart women know how to protect their families, Sarah," he said, sliding the phone back into his pocket. "You're a smart woman, aren't you?" The old table lamp cast a weak golden glow across Sarah's living room, barely illuminating the worn pages of her notebook. It was nearly midnight, but sleep felt impossible with tomorrow's trial looming ahead. On the faded blue sofa, Jake and Ethan slept peacefully, their small bodies curled together like puppies seeking warmth. Jake's arm was protectively draped over his younger brother, even in sleep trying to be the man of the house. Sarah watched their steady breathing, memorizing every detail of their innocent faces. Jake had Mark's strong jawline, while Ethan had inherited her gentle eyes. The sight of them, so vulnerable and trusting, made her heart ache with a mixture of love and fear. Duke's threats echoed in her mind, his words like poison. "Remember what happens to your boys if you talk." With trembling hands, she pulled out a fresh sheet of paper. If tomorrow went wrong, if Duke made good on his threats, she needed her sons to understand. The pen felt heavy as she began to write. "My dearest Jake and Ethan, Mommy loves you more than anything in this world. If I've done things that seem wrong, please understand it was only because I wanted to protect you both. I hope someday you'll forgive me." A tear splashed onto the paper, smudging the ink. Sarah quickly wiped her eyes, not wanting to stain the letter with her fear. She looked again at her sleeping boys. Jake's tousled hair, Ethan's thumb tucked near his mouth, like when he was a baby. They deserved better than a life built on fear and lies. The truth hit her with sudden clarity. By trying to protect them from Duke, she had actually trapped them all in his web. Every package she delivered, every lie she told, only gave him more power over their lives. Her children might be safe today, but what about tomorrow? What kind of legacy was she leaving them? Sarah folded the letter carefully and placed it in her bedside drawer. Standing in the dim light, watching her sleeping children, she made her decision. No more running, no more fear. Tomorrow, she would tell the truth, not just for herself, but for Jake and Ethan. They deserved a mother they could be proud of, not one who lived in fear of shadows. The silence of the night was shattered by the harsh buzzing of Sarah's phone. The unknown number glowing on the screen made her stomach clench. She knew, even before answering, who would be on the other end. Duke's voice slithered through the speaker, low and menacing, each word dripping with calculated malice. "Sarah," he drawled, the familiar way he said her name making her skin crawl. "I trust you're preparing for your big day in court tomorrow." He paused, letting the tension build. "I just wanted to remind you what's at stake. If you open your mouth in that courtroom, your boys will pay the price. Think carefully about the kind of mother you want to be, one who keeps her children safe, or one who never sees them again." Sarah's hand trembled as she gripped the phone, her knuckles white with tension. The threat hung in the air like a toxic cloud, seeping into her bones. Through the living room doorway, she could see Jake and Ethan still sleeping peacefully on the sofa, unaware of the danger surrounding them. The line went dead with a decisive click, but Duke's words continued to echo in her head. Sarah's heart thundered in her chest, its frantic rhythm matching the chaos of her thoughts. For a moment, the old fear threatened to overwhelm her, the same fear that had kept her under Duke's control for so long. But then, something shifted inside her. She closed her eyes, drawing in a deep breath that seemed to fill not just her lungs, but her entire being. When she opened them again, her gaze was steady, her jaw set with determination. "No," she whispered into the darkness. "No more." The words grew stronger with each repetition. "No one controls my life anymore. No one threatens my children." The decision crystallized in her heart, as clear and unbreakable as diamond. Tomorrow she would speak her truth, not despite her children, but because of them. They deserved a mother who stood up to bullies, who showed them that fear could be transformed into courage. The wooden steps to the witness stand felt like a mountain to climb. Sarah's legs trembled with each step, her heart pounding so loudly she was sure everyone in the courtroom could hear it. The microphone loomed before her, its presence both intimidating and final. Once she spoke into it, there would be no turning back. As the bailiff administered the oath, Sarah's voice barely rose above a whisper. "I do." Those two simple words seemed to echo through the hushed courtroom. She caught sight of Linda in the back row, her friend's encouraging nod providing a small anchor of strength. But then her eyes drifted to Duke, and her breath caught in her own throat. He sat at the defense table, impeccably dressed in an expensive suit, his posture relaxed and confident. The slight smirk playing at the corners of his mouth made her blood run cold. He looked more like a man attending a business meeting than someone facing serious criminal charges. Their eyes met briefly, and in that moment, Sarah saw the unspoken threat still lingering in his gaze. Mrs. Miranda, the prosecutor, approached the stand. "Mrs. Thompson, please tell the court about your involvement with Mr. Morrison." Her voice was gentle but firm, creating a space for Sarah to speak. Sarah's fingers tightened around the edge of the witness stand, her wedding ring, still worn out of habit, catching the fluorescent light. Sarah's voice cracked, and she had to clear her throat before continuing. "I made mistakes," she began again, her voice stronger this time though tears threatened at the edges. "But everything I did wasn't for myself, it was for my family." The words began to pour out, like a dam finally breaking. "After my husband left, he didn't just abandon us. He left us drowning in debt. I had 2 young boys to feed, a mortgage to pay, and bill collectors calling day and night." She paused, taking a shaky breath. In the gallery, she could see reporters scribbling furiously in their notebooks. The judge leaned forward slightly, his expression unreadable but attentive. "I was working 2 jobs, barely sleeping, just trying to keep our heads above water. That's when Duke, Mr. Morrison, found me." Sarah's voice grew stronger as she continued, though her hands still trembled. "He knew exactly what to say, exactly what to offer. He made it sound so simple at first. Just delivering packages," he said. "Just papers, nothing illegal." A bitter laugh escaped her lips. "I didn't want to believe what was really in those packages. I couldn't afford to believe it. Because once you're in, once you know the truth..." She looked directly at Duke now, her fear finally giving way to anger. "Once you're in, he owns you. He makes sure of it." Duke's smirk had faded slightly, replaced by something harder, more dangerous. But Sarah couldn't stop now. The truth was flowing out of her like a river, unstoppable and cleansing. "I'm not proud of what I did. I wake up every night thinking about it. But I want the court to understand, I wasn't just afraid for myself. Mr. Morrison made it very clear what would happen to my children if I didn't cooperate. He didn't just threaten me, he showed me photos of my boys at school, at the playground. He knew their routines, their teachers' names." Tears were flowing freely now, but Sarah's voice remained steady. "I'm here today because I can't live with this fear anymore. I can't let my sons grow up watching their mother be controlled by a man like him. They deserve better. They deserve the truth." Mrs. Miranda moved closer to the witness stand, her voice softening. "Can you tell us about your deliveries for Mr. Morrison, Mrs. Thompson?" Sarah nodded, her fingers unconsciously twisting the tissue in her hands as memories flooded back. "The first delivery was on a Tuesday," Sarah began, her voice barely steady. "A small package, not much bigger than a book. Duke, Mr. Morrison, said it was just business documents. Nothing to worry about. The money came the next day, more than I'd make in 2 weeks at the diner." She paused, swallowing hard. It seemed so easy, so simple. But then the packages got bigger, and the deliveries more frequent. Sarah's eyes grew distant as she recalled the late-night runs, the mysterious addresses, the strange men who would answer doors with knowing smirks. "We had a system. He'd text me an address, usually late at night when the streets were empty. I'd pick up the package from one location, deliver it to another. No questions asked. The money would appear in my mailbox the next day. Always cash, always in a plain envelope." Her voice cracked as she continued. "I told myself it was just courier work. I needed to believe that. The bank was threatening foreclosure. Jake needed new asthma medication. Ethan was growing out of his clothes. Every time I thought about stopping, something else would come up. Another bill, another emergency. Then Sarah's face crumpled slightly as she reached the hardest part of her testimony. I remember one night particularly well. It was pouring rain, the kind that makes it hard to see through the windshield. Ethan had been running a high fever all day, and we'd run out of children's Tylenol. I was supposed to stay home with him, but Duke called. He said this delivery couldn't wait. Tears began rolling down her cheeks, but she pressed on. I had to choose between staying with my sick child or making enough money to buy his medicine. What kind of choice is that for a mother? I tucked Ethan into bed, made Jake promise to call if his brother got worse, and drove out into that awful storm. The courtroom was dead silent now, hanging on every word. The package was heavier than usual that night. When I picked it up, I could feel something shifting it on, like stacks of paper. I knew, deep down, I knew what it probably was. But I couldn't let myself think about it. All I could think about was getting back to my boy, getting him the medicine he needed. Sarah's voice grew quieter, filled with shame and regret. I made the delivery, got paid, and rushed to the 24-hour pharmacy. When I finally got home, Ethan's fever had spiked even higher. Jake was crying, scared because his brother wouldn't wake up properly. We spent the rest of the night in the emergency room. She looked directly at the jury, her eyes pleading for understanding. I know what I did was wrong, but at that moment, watching my baby hooked up to those hospital monitors, all I could think was that at least I could pay the medical bills. Duke's face remained impassive as Sarah spoke, but his jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. In the gallery, several jurors were wiping their eyes, while others looked at Duke with barely concealed disgust. Sarah's testimony had transformed the case from a simple matter of criminal conspiracy into something far more complex, a story of a desperate mother caught in an impossible situation. Rachel Chen, Sarah's public defender, rose from her seat with measured confidence. The young lawyer's usually gentle demeanor had shifted, replaced by a steely determination that made Sarah's heart race with nervous anticipation. Your Honor, Rachel began, her voice clear and steady, I would like to present evidence that will demonstrate the true nature of Mr. Morrison's involvement in this case. She glanced briefly at Duke, who sat with his usual air of smug confidence, before continuing. This evidence will show that my client was not a willing participant, but rather a victim of systematic manipulation and threats. Duke's lawyer jumped to his feet. Objection, Your Honor, this is mere speculation. Let's hear the evidence, Judge Allen interjected, his weathered face betraying nothing but keen interest. Proceed, Ms. Chen. Rachel nodded, producing a small digital recorder. This recording was made by my client during a meeting with Mr. Morrison on October 15th of last year. She pressed play, and the courtroom fell into an expectant silence. At first, there was only the sound of rustling papers and distant traffic. Then Duke's voice filled the room, its usual smoothness twisted with malice. You're becoming a problem, Sarah. Getting cold feet now isn't an option. Sarah's trembling voice followed. I can't do this anymore, Duke. The packages, I know what's in them. I want out. A sharp laugh cut through the recording. Out? There is no out. You're in this up to your neck, and if you don't like it... There was a pause, and when Duke spoke again, his voice had dropped to a menacing whisper that somehow seemed louder than before. If you don't follow my instructions to the letter, I will make sure your life and your precious children's lives become a living hell. Do you understand? The recording continued with the sound of Sarah's stifled sob and Duke's cold chuckle. Think about Jake and Ethan. Such sweet boys. It would be a shame if something happened to them because their mother made a stupid decision. Rachel stopped the playback. The silence that followed was deafening. Sarah dared to look at Duke, watching as his confident facade cracked. His face had drained of color, his jaw clenched so tight she could see the muscle twitching. Your Honor, Duke's lawyer stammered, rising again. This recording could easily have been doctored. We have had the recording authenticated by forensic experts, Rachel interrupted, producing a thick folder. Their report confirms its authenticity, including voice pattern analysis matching Mr. Morrison's voice. Additionally, she continued, pulling out another document, We have records of Mr. Morrison's phone locations corresponding to the time and place this recording was made. Duke suddenly lurched forward, his composed demeanor shattering completely. "She's lying," he snarled, pointing at Sarah. "She was a willing participant. She knew exactly what she was doing." "Mr. Morrison, control yourself." Judge Allen's voice cracked like a whip across the courtroom. The bailiff moved closer to Duke's table, but the damage was already done. His outburst had revealed the monster beneath the polished exterior. Sarah watched as Miranda Harrison, the prosecutor who had been so intent on proving her guilt, slowly turned to study Duke with new eyes. The sharp-featured lawyer's expression had shifted from stern determination to dawning understanding. "Your Honor," Miranda said, rising slowly, "in light of this new evidence, the state would like to request a brief recess to reassess our position regarding Mrs. Thompson's involvement in this case." Judge Allen nodded gravely. "Granted, this court will recess for 1 hour." His gavel fell with a sharp crack that seemed to echo Sarah's racing heartbeat. As the courtroom erupted into murmurs and movement, Sarah remained seated, her mother's necklace clutched tightly in her trembling hand. She could feel Linda's supportive presence from the gallery behind her, could almost see her friend's proud smile. For the first time since this nightmare began, Sarah felt the weight on her shoulders beginning to lift. The truth finally was coming to light. The courtroom fell into a hushed silence as Judge David Allen sat back in his chair, his silver hair catching the afternoon light streaming through the high windows. His weathered hands moved deliberately through the stack of documents before him, each page telling its part of Sarah's story. The weight of countless similar cases showed in the deep lines of his face, but there was something different in his eyes as he regarded Sarah Thompson. For what seemed like an eternity, the only sound was the gentle rustling of paper and the muted ticking of the courtroom clock. Sarah held her breath, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She could feel Duke's burning glare from across the room, but she kept her eyes fixed on the judge, watching as he removed his glasses and thoughtfully cleaned them with the edge of his robe. Finally, Judge Allen leaned forward, his presence commanding attention without a word spoken. His voice, when it came, carried the weight of decades of experience, yet held an unmistakable note of compassion. "In my years on this bench," he began, his tone measured and clear, "I have seen many cases that challenge our understanding of right and wrong. This is one such case." He paused, his gaze moving from Sarah to Duke, then back again. "The law exists not just to punish, but to protect, to serve justice in its truest form." The judge's eyes settled on Sarah with an intensity that seemed to peer into her very soul. Mrs. Thompson's actions cannot be dismissed, but neither can the circumstances that led to them. This case serves as a sobering reminder that sometimes people are driven to desperate choices by desperate circumstances. He turned his attention to Duke, his expression hardening. "However, what we cannot and will not tolerate is the calculated exploitation of such desperation. This court has heard evidence of how Mr. Morrison systematically targeted and manipulated vulnerable individuals, using their children as leverage for his criminal enterprise." Judge Allen's voice grew stronger, filling every corner of the courtroom. This case stands as a stark reminder that, while circumstances may drive people to the edge of despair, we cannot allow predators like Duke Morrison to continue exploiting those in their most vulnerable moments. The true measure of our justice system lies not just in punishing wrongdoing, but in protecting those who need it most. Judge Allen straightened in his chair, his expression resolute as he delivered the verdict that would change multiple lives forever. In the case of the state versus Sarah Thompson, this court finds that while the defendant did participate in illegal activities, her actions were conducted under severe duress and threat to her family's safety. He paused, looking directly at Sarah. "Mrs. Thompson, you will not face imprisonment. However, you are sentenced to 200 hours of community service and must complete a rehabilitation program designed to help you rebuild your life." A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom. Sarah's knees weakened, and she gripped the table for support as tears of relief streamed down her face. Behind her, she could hear Linda's muffled sob of joy. Rachel, her attorney, squeezed her arm gently, a small smile of triumph on her face. But Judge Allen wasn't finished. His attention turned to Duke Morrison, his expression hardening. "As for Mr. Morrison, given the evidence presented today and the serious nature of his actions, I am ordering his immediate arrest pending further investigation into his criminal activities. Bailiff, take him into custody. Miranda Harrison, Duke's attorney, immediately rose to her feet. Your Honor, we object to this ruling. There's no substantial evidence. The evidence speaks for itself, Counselor. Judge Allen cut her off firmly. Your client's own words and actions in this courtroom have only reinforced its validity. Duke exploded from his chair, his carefully maintained facade cracking completely. This is absurd, he snarled, shoving Miranda aside as she tried to calm him. She's the criminal. She knew exactly what she was doing. This whole thing is a setup. Two bailiffs moved swiftly to restrain him. The sound of handcuffs clicking into place echoed through the stunned courtroom. Miranda stood helplessly by, her usual commanding presence diminished as her client's true nature revealed itself before the entire court. The gallery erupted into chaos. Several women in the back, who Sarah recognized as other mothers from her neighborhood, burst into applause. An elderly man stood up, shouting, "Justice at last," while others nodded in vigorous agreement. However, near the middle of the room, a group of Duke's business associates sat in stony silence, exchanging worried glances. Duke continued to struggle as the bailiffs led him toward the side door. "This isn't over, Sarah," he shouted over his shoulder, his face contorted with rage. "You'll regret this." Miranda quickly gathered her papers, her sharp features tight with controlled anger at how quickly the case had unraveled. Sarah couldn't stop her hands from trembling as she watched Duke being led away. His threats no longer held any power over her. Instead of fear, she felt an overwhelming sense of liberation. The chains of manipulation and threat that had bound her for so long were finally broken. "Court is adjourned," Judge Allen announced, his gavel falling one final time. As people began to file out, many stopped to pat Sarah's shoulder or offer quiet words of support. A young woman with tears in her eyes paused beside her. "Thank you for being brave enough to speak up," she whispered. "You helped all of us." Linda rushed forward to envelop Sarah in a tight embrace. "It's over," she murmured. "You did it, Sarah. You really did it." Sarah could only nod, too overwhelmed to speak. Her thoughts were already with Jake and Ethan, imagining their faces when she told them they were finally truly safe. As the courtroom slowly emptied, Sarah remained standing at the defense table, her mother's necklace clutched tightly in her hand. Through her tears, she watched Miranda Harrison gather her belongings, their eyes meeting briefly across the room. In that moment, Sarah saw something shift in the attorney's stern gaze. Perhaps a grudging recognition that justice had truly been served, despite her client's guilt. In the weeks following the trial, Sarah discovered that her act of courage had created ripples far beyond her own life. The local women's support organization, New Beginnings, reached out to her through Linda. Their director, a warm-hearted woman named Patricia Wells, invited Sarah to their office in a converted Victorian house downtown. "What you did in that courtroom," Patricia said, sitting across from Sarah in a sunny corner office, "gave others the courage to come forward." She slid a folder across the desk. "We'd like to help you get back on your feet. There's a position open at our organization. Administrative work, steady hours, and most importantly, it comes with childcare assistance." Sarah's hands trembled as she opened the folder. The salary wasn't extraordinary, but it was stable, and the hours would let her be home when Jake and Ethan returned from school. "I don't know what to say," she whispered, tears welling in her eyes. "Say yes," Patricia smiled. "And there's more. We have a network of professional women who volunteer their time. There's a financial advisor who can help you manage your debts, and a counselor who specializes in helping families heal from trauma." But the most profound change came during the support group meetings. One by one, other women began to share their stories. Maria, a single mother of 3, revealed how Duke had threatened to report her undocumented status if she didn't cooperate. Helen, a former nurse, spoke about how he'd exploited her after her husband's medical bills left her desperate. "I was so ashamed," Helen said one evening, her voice thick with emotion. "But watching you stand up to him, Sarah, it made me realize I didn't have to carry this shame anymore." Around the room, heads nodded in agreement. The women formed a tight-knit network, sharing childcare duties, job leads, and emotional support. When Sarah mentioned Jake needed help with math, a retired teacher in the group offered to tutor him. When Ethan had a birthday coming up, They organized a surprise party, complete with homemade decorations and a superhero-themed cake. "We're not victims anymore," Maria declared during one meeting, her eyes shining with determination. "We're survivors, and we're stronger together." Sarah looked around the room at these women, mothers, daughters, sisters, all of whom had found their voice because she had dared to speak first. The chains of fear that Duke had wrapped around them were breaking, link by link, replaced by bonds of friendship and support that grew stronger each day. With her new job's regular hours, Sarah finally had precious evening time with Jake and Ethan. Their small apartment, once filled with tension and unspoken fears, gradually transformed into a warm haven of laughter and honest conversations. Each night they gathered around the dinner table, a simple ritual that had once seemed impossible amid her chaotic schedule. One evening, as Sarah helped Jake with his homework, he looked up from his textbook with questioning eyes. "Mom, Tommy at school asked why you were in the newspaper. He said his dad called you a hero." Sarah set down her pen, choosing her words carefully. "Sometimes, sweetheart, doing the right thing is very hard. It's like when you told me about seeing Billy steal from the cafeteria. Remember how scared you were to speak up?" Jake nodded solemnly. "But you said we should always tell the truth, even when it's scary." "That's right," Sarah smiled, running her hand through his hair. "And sometimes grown-ups have to make the same choice. I had to tell the truth about some bad things, even though it was frightening." From the living room floor where he was playing with his dinosaurs, 6-year-old Ethan looked up. "Were you scared, Mommy?" "I was," Sarah admitted, moving to sit on the floor beside him. "Very scared, but I kept thinking about you two and how I wanted to teach you to be brave and honest." Jake abandoned his homework and joined them on the floor. "Like when you testified against the bad man?" he asked, showing an understanding beyond his years. Sarah pulled both boys close. "Exactly like that, because being brave doesn't mean you are not afraid. It means doing what's right even when you are afraid." Ethan snuggled closer. "Is that why we don't have to whisper anymore when we talk? Or hide when people knock on the door?" Sarah's heart clenched at the innocent question, reminded of how their fear had affected even the smallest aspects of their lives. "Yes, baby, that's exactly why." Jake sat up straight, his young face serious. "Mom," he said, his voice steady and clear, "we're proud of you." Ethan nodded enthusiastically, adding, "Super proud." The simple words, spoken with such pure conviction, broke something open in Sarah's heart. Tears spilled down her cheeks as she gathered her boys in her arms, holding them tight. All the struggles, the fear, the painful choices, in this moment, they were worth it. Her children not only understood, but were proud of her courage. "I love you both so much," she whispered into their embrace, her tears falling freely now. "Everything I did, everything I'll ever do, is for you." 1 year later, Sarah stood at the podium of the National Women's Justice Conference, looking out over a sea of faces. The spotlight felt warm on her face, but for the first time in her life, she welcomed the attention. Her simple black dress and her mother's necklace reflected the quiet confidence she'd gained over the past year. "When I first stood in that courtroom," she began, her voice clear and strong, "I was terrified, but I learned something profound that day. The truth, no matter how difficult, is our only path to freedom from fear and injustice." She paused, letting her words sink in. Each of us has a voice, and when we dare to use it, we don't just free ourselves, we help free others. In the front row, Jake and Ethan sat with Linda, both boys beaming with pride. Jake, now 11, sat tall in his chair, while Ethan bounced excitedly whenever the audience applauded. They were no longer the frightened children who had once hidden from knocks at the door. After the conference, Sarah drove her family home, not to their old apartment, but to a modest house in a quiet neighborhood. The small garden they had planted together was beginning to bloom, yellow daffodils pushing up through the spring soil. Their new home wasn't fancy, but it was theirs, purchased with Sarah's savings from her work at New Beginnings and her growing role as an advocate for domestic justice. As they walked up the path, Ethan ran ahead to check on the butterfly garden he had started, while Jake collected the mail. Sarah paused at the doorway, watching her sons. The afternoon sun caught the silver of her mother's necklace, and she touched it gently, grateful for how far they'd come. Race you to dinner, Ethan called out, and both boys dashed inside, their laughter echoing through the house. Sarah followed them in, smiling. The past was behind them now, transformed from a burden into a source of strength, and their future stretched ahead, bright with possibility. What do you think about Sarah's story? Should she have received a second chance, or did she get off too easy? Let me know in the comments below. And if you want to see more videos like this, be sure to check out our next video, where we'll be diving into another incredible true story. Thanks for watching.